What is going on, guys? So today we're going to be doing a class tier list for update 36 and the Firesong DLC. Now, I've actually recorded this video several times over. I've had a lot of collaboration with other creators, and I feel very comfortable with this list. But also, I feel like just the conventional STAM and MAG variation of a tier list doesn't give it enough justice and doesn't describe the intricacies of the game in general and the classes in general. So I decided to add a purple class, and that's going to be a mix between MAG and STAM, and I think this will paint a better picture. It gets some kind of confusing a little bit, but I think this gives you a better representation of the classes in general and how I would rank them. So we have the meta classes. This is S tier, this is A tier, this is really good. B tier is going to be average, and Can't Stomach is C tier. It's just not as fun to play or enjoyable, and D tier is just don't play it unless you are a masochist, if I'm being honest. I guess the next thing we can go over is the classes. So this is DK, this is Nightblade, this is Templar, this is Sorcerer, this is Necromancer, and this is Warden. And one other explanation I do want to notate before we start is the way I view a hybrid class is if they use the off-stat resource quite extensively. So what I mean by that is, like, for example, a DK. Okay, they're utilizing, if they're like a hybrid DK, they're going to be utilizing Coagulating Blood, they're going to be utilizing Molten Whip. But also, I think a hybrid DK will utilize something like Resolving Vigor or some type of stamina skills. And what differentiates that between a Magic DK is a Magic DK may use a Flame Staff and Sword and Board. They may still even use Vigor, but they're using more of a Magicka type of toolkit. Now, if you have like a conventional STAM DK, I think that they are going to be going with something like 2H and Bow or 2H Sword and Board, but they're not going to be utilizing any type of heavily magic skills, so like Molten Whip, or they're going to be using something like Coag. They're not going to be using that at all. That's how I view a STAM DK. So it's all about the weapon choice to some degree, but also it's about skill choice and what you're using, if that makes any sense. So I think the best place to start is with Nightblade. I think this paints the picture very clearly. I think the Magic Nightblade is B tier. I think the Stamina Nightblade is S tier, and I think the hybrid blade is better than the STAM blade in my opinion. So let's start off with the Mag blade. The reason why it's B tier is melee is just much better. It has more burst potential. Using a Mag blade, you can still play melee. This is where things get complicated. Is the Mag blade can still play melee, but that is more or less a hybrid blade. The way I view a Mag blade is playing with a staff, like a Destro and a Resto, using Swallow Soul. And in this current meta, that is not as viable. But when you compare this something to like a hybrid STAM blade spec, how it's more of a stamina variant, it's based off that playstyle, but just utilizing a lot of the magic buffs, like a Steel Weapon, like the Magicka Spec Bow, utilizing Refreshing Path to give you the high uptime on concealed weapons, damage increase, and then you were utilizing Healthy Offering, that was a massive buff for the Nightblade, and then you're utilizing Resolving Vigor. It's a hybrid blade, and that hits much harder than the conventional 2H and Bow STAM blade. Now, that's what I personally play, and that's what I enjoy, at least right now, as I'm trying to gain a little bit more CP. The STAM blade is going to be playing with a 2H and Bow, more or less, and they're going to be still utilizing Healthy Offering, but it's still a stamina type of spec. And this thing hits hard. It's got a lot of movement and a lot of repositioning with Shade and Shadowy Disguise. It's probably the most noticeable and most, I guess, nostalgic type of build that you can play in ESO if you are a long-time player. It's very fun. It's very fast-paced, but it just hits hard. It has a lot of survivability, a lot of damage. And in this tank meta, you have to have damage. If you don't have damage, you're not going to have fun in PvP. So next we have the DKs. I think the DKs are pretty interesting. I'm gonna place them in this type of situation. Again, keep in mind, STAM DK does not utilize as much of magic abilities as like something like a hybrid DK would. That's why it's ranked higher. I think the Magicka abilities that DK have, especially for survivability, like Coagulating Blood, like Cauterize, really help the survivability, but also being able to utilize Molten Whip instead of Dizzy Swing has a lot more pressure and more damage, in my opinion. Now, Molten Whip did get nerfed, but it still is very strong, and it still does allow for some decent burst potential. The hybrid DK utilizing, I mean, you could even go Sword and Board and 2H on a hybrid DK, and that's still, it's very similar to a STAM DK's playstyle, but it basically just trades out Dizzy Swing for Molten Whip. Now, the Magic DK, on the other hand, they could still utilize Vigor if they wanted to, but this is going to be something like a Destro and Sword and Board build. I think the Magic DK with Sea Serpent's Coil and any DK with Sea Serpent's Coil, it's just obnoxious damage right now. It's just adds so much pressure, and you don't have to be fast with a DK, because if they come into melee range against you, you have things like Fossilize and things like Talons if you're playing like a Magic DK variant to kind of lock them down and keep them within your reach, so you can absolutely just nuke them with your dots. Like with your Embers and Engulfing Flames, and also don't forget your Flames of Oblivion, and then you could slap them in the face with either Flame Lash or Molten Whip, whatever more if you prefer. So I think DKs right now are in a very decent spot, but I have to tip it off to the hybrid DK and the Magic DK being a little bit better than the conventional Stam DK. So now let's go over the Wardens. I think, in my opinion right now, Warden is probably better than DK in most 1vx situations. So I'm going to go with something like this. I think that, like I said, Warden is a really strong class. I think the Magden right now, utilizing Ice Staff, is completely insane. It has so much pressure, so much burst potential. Arctic Blast is actually a good CC now. It just has a lot of damage. I mean, you have so much CC potential with Blockade, being able to perma-root people, with Arctic Blast being able to stun people really cleverly. Like it's a very weird type of events that are unfolding whenever you get hit by Arctic Blast, because like sometimes you don't even notice you're CC'd yet for at least a few seconds, and you can definitely catch some people with some massive burst. But for the Stamina Warden and the Hybrid Warden, we'll get into the Hybrid Warden here in a second. But the Stamina Warden has so much survivability. If you're stacking a lot of health and utilizing Arctic Wind, you're really going to be insanely tanky. You can still go with the conventional 2H and Sword and Board setup, and you're going to have 40k health. Arctic Wind's going to be ticking on you and giving you so much healing potential. With the change to Wings, giving you access to now running Rally as well. You have 2 burst heals on the Warden. You're not going to die. You can go with the Stamina Shocks or the Magic Shocks. Probably the magical ones are a little bit better, but you have a little bit less damage, and that's why they're not in the S tier. Is when they change the Ice Staff passive to give the Magical Warden and the Ice Warden a more of viability, they did nerf the Stamina Warden spec, which is still strong, but it just doesn't have as much burst potential as it did before. Now, the Hybrid Warden is very interesting, and I've played this a few different ways, but I think it's best played with like Dual Wield and Resto. You're still like kind of like a Magden, utilizing the Budding Seeds type of heal, but you can also still use Arctic Blast on your front bar to provide some offensive pressure. And it's a hybrid is what it is. It's pairing up like the best parts of a Stamden with Resolving Vigor and Whirling Blades, with the best parts of the Magden, utilizing, Healthy Offering, utilizing Budding Seeds, and it's just overall a very fun playstyle. But I still tip my hat off to the Magden. I think it's going to have more damage simply because of the changes to the Ice Staff for that class. Now we could talk about the Sorcerer. So I think Stamp Sorc right now is a solid A tier. I think the Hybrid Sorc is average, and I think the Magic Sorc is below average, and don't play it. So, how I got to this conclusion is just Mag Sorc, it has no survivability outside of streaking and running away from your target, and that's just not a very fun playstyle for me personally. It's got good burst damage and good pressure, but ever since they changed the speed of Crystal Fragments, it really, like, their burst is really slow, and you have to catch people through roll dodge all the time, and if you can't do that, or if you're not lucky, you're not going to have any burst damage, and your defenses really aren't there. Your offensive pressure is there. You just got to catch people, and it is very, very painful to try to do that. The Hybrid Sorc, on the other hand, is pretty decent. I would view this as a Magicka Sorc, but with mostly stamina survivability skills, but also utilizing Crushing Weapon with a Fire Staff. That's how I would view a Hybrid Sorc. Is it going to be a Stam Sorc defensively? Like, you can use something like Nice did a few patches ago. Now, they did nerf that spec a little bit, but I still think it's going to be semi-viable. You could use the Crushing Weapon, and then use some overloads in there as well. And then you also have 2H on your back bar with a burst heal with Rally. And you could use Ball of Lightning, and or even streak if you want to. It just depends. There's not really a whole lot of these hybrid sorks out there, but at least a theory and how I would set this up, I think it's a solid B tier. It's not going to perform like anything crazy, but it's definitely interesting and a niche spec that is really fun to play. And then Stamp Sorks. I think Stamp Sorks, they are probably, they're better than the B tier, I would say. It's hard, like Stamp Sorks have a lot of burst potential and pressure with Crystal Weapon and Streak and Curse and all of that, but it doesn't have the qualities of an S tier class, but it doesn't have the negatives of being a B tier class. Like, it's got good tankiness to some degree, utilizing your Hurricane and your overall speed in general. Being able to not get hit means you don't have to have like as much mitigation as something like a DK, but you're very quick, you're very fast, you have a lot of burst. That burst has been nerfed, but it still is strong, and utilizing Vanishing 2H with Curse, Crystal Weapon, and a Meteor combo with Streak will absolutely nuke people at times. It just depends. Like, if you're going against the DKs that are very tanky, then it's going to be a little bit harder. But I think overall, the Stamp Sork's in a good spot. I think it's the bottom of the A tier though, but it doesn't have the negatives of the B tier of, like, you don't have enough burst potential and damage. You don't have enough tankiness like your other counterparts do. So Stamp Sork is in a decent spot. It could be better, but it's probably the bottom of the A tier, just barely above B tier in my opinion. Now we have the Templars. So this is where I would rank the Templars. A tier for the Magplar. I think these are kind of paired up together pretty well. They're better than B tier, but they're not like top of the line A tier, if that makes sense. So the Magplar, it's got good damage, but that's only with a range type of spec, utilizing Javelin, utilizing Crushing Shock, and playing the range Polar playstyle with Purifying Light and Radiant Oppression. It has good pressure and good burst potential, but with Purifying Light's nerf, it's not really as potent, but it still does some decent damage. It's definitely unique and different compared to the conventional Magplar playstyle that had been played for so long, utilizing Puncturing Sweeps. We have to talk about that. Puncturing Sweeps and Binding Jabs are not as good as they used to be. With the nerf to Burning Light, the nerf to the overall tick rate, yeah, it's a little bit quicker, but it only procs 3 times. Now you have more chances to proc Burning Light outside of your Ajax Spear abilities, which I don't like. I think they should revert that change back to the old Puncturing Sweeps animation, because it just feels really clunky and weird right now. It just doesn't look right. But also they nerf Purifying Light, which I think was which was right. But I think that they shouldn't have nerfed Burning Light before. I think they should have kept that the same and nerf Purifying Light instead of changing the whole jabs animation and whatnot. That's why, like, Magplar could probably be S tier if it still had decent sweeps, or at least would be higher in the A tier. But since the nerf to sweeps, and this definitely affects the Stamplar as well, it doesn't have as much damage. And if we're being honest, the Hybrid Plar is pretty much the Stamplar now. Like, Stamplar isn't really a thing anymore. You don't have just Rally and Vigor on a Stamplar anymore. You're utilizing Honor the Dead now. So, like, Stamplar is basically dead in that sense. Like, it still has some aspects in the Hybrid Plar, but if you're going, I mean, honestly, I would probably put, without a Stamplar utilizing Honor the Dead, I would put that in, like, don't play tier, honestly. But if you're talking about like a Fire Staff in 2H or a Lightning Staff in 2H Hybrid Plar, I think that could be definitely interesting, and that's why I'm still keeping them the same, because they're still decent, but they're just nothing crazy. There's not really a whole lot of Hybrid Plars out there right now. Like if you're talking like weird type of weapon combinations, you're typically going to see dual wield Resto, or dual wield 2H, or you're going to see, you know, 2H Sword and Board, whatever the case is. But for like the Templars, you're going to see dual wield Resto, dual wield Sword and Board even, but probably Resto just for the heavy attack resource management. But overall, Templars are not bad. They're not great, but they're not bad. And then we have the Necromancers. And then we have the Necromancers. So this is where I would rank the Necros. Macro, like, you can easily, like, these are pretty much interchangeable, honestly. They all play the same build. They're the same thing, but just different variations of it. Like, actually, let's just do this. I think this is Can't Stomach Necromancer, because they all play the same playstyle with Dark Convergence and something like Vicious Death or Plague Break. They all do it. There is not a viable, like, Necro spec that is not just an absolute tank that you just spam bash, or it's not just a very tanky Necro that just kind of has a war of attrition with the other player. It has, the Blastbone sucks. Like, sometimes it hits very hard, but sometimes it just is an absolute moron. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do, and it doesn't have any pressure. Something, when you compare that to the shocks on the Warden, it's just night and day difference of the overall reliability of burst potential with the shocks rather than the Blastbones. Now, sometimes you can get nuked by Blastbones, and especially for the Magicka Necros Blastbones, I've been hit by that on my Nightblade for like 13, 14k. It hits obnoxiously hard when it lands, but that's like 20% of the time sometimes. These all play with the Harmony burst potential for the most part. The only class that plays something different that can, but is probably not going to be anywhere near as good, is going to be the Mag Necro, utilizing something like the Master's Fire Staff, and using Blastbones and using like a conventional, like a range spec. But it's just not going to do something like crazy. The Stam Crow, on the other hand, you could do something like a Dot Crow, which I think is pretty fun to play. Nice has played that several times with the Poison Ultimate from the bow. Toxic Barrage, and has just a lot of dots because they have extra dot damage based on their class passives. Definitely a very interesting spec, and it's still tanky with Resilient Flesh and Mender, but it's just not as strong as it used to be, I would say, because the Mender has been nerfed, and Resilient Flesh is basically the only thing you have for survivability other than something like Rally. So with that being said, for 1vx situations, now, don't get me wrong, if you play these with bombing, you could still 1vx with these. That's not to say that they are bad, they were just a one-trick pony compared to all the other classes that have so many other different toolkits for these type of situations, where Necro is, if they don't kill you in their Dark Convergence, Plague Break, or VD combo, that's all they got until they get their ultimate up again and get their combo up again, if I'm being honest. So this is all for 1vx type of situations. This is my tier list. I think this is pretty solid. I think you have the top of the line classes right now that you can't go wrong with. That are going to perform at the highest level, especially if you don't have a lot of time to really play and you just want to play the best classes. These are definitely probably up there. And then you have you can't go wrong with these either. I mean, these are definitely decent specs. They're not as good as S tier, but they're definitely going to be pretty solid for most situations, and they're going to be able to weather patches easier. Like, if there's, like, I could see a Nightblade nerf coming next patch because of how well they're performing right now. Spec bow right now is hitting much harder, especially for the hybrid spec with like dual wield and ice staff is hitting insanely hard. Like, you're talking 25k spec bows on people, which is hitting harder than ultimates. It's hitting harder than NCAP right now. I could definitely see a nerf to spec bow. But overall, yeah, this is my tier list. Let me know what you guys think. Am I wrong? Am I right? I had definitely some big insight from my stream, and also from Nice. They came in and talked about it. I wanted to add this hybrid because I think it adds a little bit more depth to it. Because if you take out these hybrids, you don't get the clear picture. Like, I just don't think you would. Like, I don't know. I just think this adds more depth to it, because if you say like Stam DK is A tier, it's like, yeah, but it's basically like a magic DK, but with some stamina abilities. So that, I think that the hybrid gives a little bit more context to the situation. Because if I was to put Magblade in A tier or S tier, where the hybrid blade is like, Magblade is not good, but hybrid blade is much better because it's basically just a Stam blade at that point. I think this provides just a little bit more context to the overall meta right now and what classes are performing at the highest level. I will be leveling up some of these classes over this update, and we'll be doing some build videos on them to give you guys some builds to run. But if you guys have any questions, definitely come by and check out the stream, and I will try to answer what I would run on certain specs if you guys want to have ideas for, you know, typically the best classes. But yeah, that's going to be it for me, guys. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace out.